We are studying the book of Genesis. We have done a cursory look at Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3, and 4. It is important to remind you, we are not studying Genesis because we want to become theologians. We're studying Genesis because everything starts from there. God's mind, God's plans, God's creation, the problem of sin, the fall, Satan, everything is there. It starts there. And the pastor has spoken about this for years now. I mean, if we collect all his sayings over the years, we would see that he has never deviated from one particular line of truth, and that is, God has a very special plan for man. God wants to do something with man and through man, and of course there is a force that is hindering it, a force that is opposing it. We know it's Satan. And that opposition starts from the very first page of the Bible. It is a battle of two forces. One wants to bring about his mind in space and time, and man is that instrument, man is that vessel, and the other force is trying to oppose it and destroy it. And this is really the story of the Bible. From the beginning to the end, it is the battle of these two powers, and of course, we know who will win at the end, but it is interesting to see how it unfolds in history, in time. And of course, not going to go back to the first 4 chapters, but the fall of man, which was foreseen by God. God never got surprised and caught off guard. Oh my goodness, what happened? Man fell. No, he knew that man had free will, and because he had a free will, he would make decisions. And because he made the decision by being deceived through Satan, he chose the wrong side. But God promised that he will send a seed from the woman that would come and correct everything. And therefore, the story of the Old Testament is the battle of these two powers over the coming of that seed, the promised seed, who was going to be Jesus Christ. And Satan, with all his power, is attempting to stop the appearance of the seed, because the moment the seed comes, the game is over. He's going to lose his power, his kingdom, his hold on everything that he has stolen from man. So when you read the Old Testament, keep that in mind all the time. There are two opposing forces fighting over that little seed that was promised to Eve. And therefore, in chapter 1, you see the creation. The chapter 2, you see man appearing on earth. Chapter 3, you see the deception and the fall of man and the promise of the seed. And chapter 4, we see what the results of sin were, how it corrupted man, how it made man even move further away from God. And the original promise that God had made in Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our own image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion, that was just basically done away with, or so Satan thought. So we now come to chapter 5, and I'm going to read only portions of chapter 5 because there are genealogies in chapter 5. Now, one explanation about these names, difficult names to pronounce, Hebrew names, many of them we're not even familiar with these names. The reason genealogies are there in the scriptures as serving for many purposes, but one primary reason is to show how God is moving this seed from one generation to the other generation. That is a very important reason genealogies are there, because God is trying to show us actually where the seed is moving, from this generation going to the other one, going to the other one. So when you read the genealogies, you would be able to track down the seed from the beginning to the very end when Jesus appears. So that's why in Genesis 5, we would read the first set of genealogy, and that is the genealogy of Seth. So now let's move to the content of chapter 5. So here we have chapter 5. It says, in the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. Just a footnote here. I think there's a great revelation there, which my sister Erica caught this in her readings, and then the pastor got into it, and then we all started to think about it as a family. But I'm sure at some point probably they will share this one little thing here. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and named them man. So when we talk about man in the English language, obviously nowadays, to be politically correct or use the correct distinctions, we say male and female. But in the Bible, when it says man, it is not a sexist comment. It is not mentioning only masculine gender. It's talking about entire human race, because that's where it calls it man. In the day when they were created, just before that, it says they were male and female. So male and female constitute what is man. Or in some translations, they would say mankind, which is also a good translation. So when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness according to his image, and named him Seth. That's Genesis chapter 5, verse 2 and 3. So what do we learn from these verses? Well, let's read a couple more, and then we see what happens here. Then the days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years. So do the math, 800 years after Seth, 130 years before Seth. So Adam lived a total of 930 years. And it says he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Adam, the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Genesis chapter 4, verse 4 and 5. So what do we learn from this record? Well, the created man, he created them male and female. God created them male and female. Just a very brief explanation that in God's mind, when he created man in his own image and likeness, he never looked at a singular human. We always think in Genesis 1:26, when it says, let us make man in our image and according to our likeness, he was actually looking at Adam. He wasn't. He was first of all looking at a collective mankind, and that collective mankind will one day appear. It's not seen today. The world doesn't see that collective man, but the prototype and the ideal man that God had in mind, we know it is his son, Jesus Christ. But the creation of humankind, even then, God did not only single out Adam, because some people will say, well, what about Eve? Just because she's a woman, she had no share in the image and likeness? Well, no, because God created them male and female, and as far as he was concerned, he always saw them as one unit. He never saw them separately. And that's why when God looks at us today, he sees Christ and the church together, connected together, one body. Paul says in Ephesians 5, this is a great mystery, that Christ and the church is really what we portray in the act of marriage. So he blessed them and named them man. So we see here a collective man. They have the blessing of God up to the point of the fall. And of course, their name was man. So I would say their last name was man. Adam the man, Eve the man. Collectively, Mr. and Mrs. Man. That's what you can conclude. They belong to the human kind or mankind. So moving on further, here's really the sad commentary. Adam had a son in his own likeness. You remember God created man in his own image and likeness, and had man, meaning Adam and Eve, taken of the right tree, which is the tree of life, they would have received the life of God. And from that point on, as they created the human society, their children would have been in the likeness and the image of the Creator, because they had that life and that life would have been a life that would be dominant life in the lives of every human being. But they didn't have that life. They didn't take that life. And therefore, all Adam could do was to just make a copy of himself. Adam made a copy of himself. From a DNA point of view, he just made a copy, and that was a child. So man began to reproduce and have children in his own image and likeness. Well, what kind of an image does Adam have at this point? He doesn't have the right image. He doesn't have the right likeness because he's lost them all. He has been deceived. He has surrendered his soul to Satan. He has now become a slave, a captive to his powers of his soul. He's no longer in spiritual communion with God. He's no longer communicating with God. God is distant. He's far away. And all he's got to live by is his mind, his emotions, and his will. When he has no further connection with God, all you can count on is yourself. So he himself is now got to rely on himself to be able to survive, perhaps in a very hostile world. It is not living in Toronto. At the time, there was no Toronto. So he could feel safe. There was all wilderness. It was all very wild animals and beasts wandering out there. There was no protection. That's why in chapter 4 we read that Cain went and built a city. I said city was a symbol of safety and security. So the original mold was marred and rendered useless because of sin. When God created man, he is just like a manufacturer, even though it's not a very nice way of describing it. But if you take a manufacturing manufactured product, well, the designer has something in mind. If I have to design this glass here, well, obviously someone sat down and thought about what kind of a glass I want to have. The shape, the angles, the curvature, the capacity, the quality, everything had to be designed and calculated. And God has done that at the time he created Adam and Eve. Everything was calculated to perfection. And yet if something happens along the way and someone sabotages the mold, the original mold, and puts a little hole in it or some abnormality in it, every glass that comes out of that mold is automatically defective. And what happened is Adam and Eve really surrendered themselves to a saboteur, someone who got into their head, got into the headspace, and completely twisted their mind in thinking that they themselves can be their own God. That was the entire story of chapter 3. Satan, all he had to do is to convince them that you can be your own God. You can run your own life. And that was getting into their headspace and turning the circuitry around, and man became a mold that no longer could represent the original design. He just got completely warped, and every child that comes out of that kind of a father and a mother, by the virtue of the defect in the original design, not because God designed it that way, but it was done that way, they allowed a power to come in and twist it around. So every child born of a natural parents are carrying the defect. That's why Christianity is unlike other religions. We say man by nature is a sinner. Well, you could use the word, say, man by birth is defective. There is a defect that we inherit, not because we're bad people, but that's how it is. Can't change it. Unless you go back to the original mold and redesign it and have the perfect mold. And God actually redesigned and introduced the right mold, the perfect mold, 2,000 years ago. What do you think he did when Jesus was born in the manger of Bethlehem? He introduced a brand new design, a brand new mold, and he gave us the option of which one do we want to be taken from. Are we going to take it from that defective mold, or are we going to allow ourselves to be taken from the new mold? When you become a Christian, what do you think happens to you? God reproduces you from a new mold, and that new mold has been redesigned, perfect, no defects, will never fail, and that is the person of Jesus Christ. So what happens when we are born of that life? We will start looking like that life in time. So the original mold was marred and rendered useless because of sin. Sin is a defect. Sin is a deviation from the original plan and purpose. Well, the final release or the final outcome of this defect it's a very sad comment. Adam, after 930 years, it says he died. That is the first recorded natural death, because Abel was murdered. But here we have the first time a man dies. And I don't know how they took it. I think both these incidents were extremely horrific to the families. Watching Adam, who was that beautiful, handsome man that God had created in the garden. Now he's 930 years old. He's probably all wrinkled up, an old man, weak, useless, cannot do anything but to lie down on his bed and finally give out the last breath and die. That's a sad commentary. Death rules with power and has its first recorded natural death. Adam died. Every time we see a loved one die, we have to remember it is the result of that defective mold that has caused the person to experience that. By the way, the mold, I think, was misspelled M-O-L-D. It should be M-O-U-L-D, if I'm not mistaken. So I didn't pay attention to it. So in Adam all die, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 22, it says, "For as in Adam all die, and so in Christ all we will be made alive." If you're born in Adam, or in other words, you are a descendant of that original mold, you will die, because the first one died. And if the first one died, everybody else that has come out of that original mold because of the defect of sin will die. And that is a truth that cannot be argued. My dad always has said, you want to know if sin is real or not, go to the cemeteries. That's where you see the power of sin in full force and operation. And of course, before I get to that, from that point on, from verse 6 onwards, you're going to read the genealogy of the children of Seth. So I'm not going to read these names, because all it tells you is there were now two families coming from Adam. You have the family of Cain, a corrupt man, away from God, selfish, someone who has absolutely no interest in God. And then you have someone like Seth that has replaced Abel. And I told you in the last meeting, Abel is a type of Christ in his death, and Seth is a type of Christ in his resurrection, a new life, a new family starting. And this point on, you read the genealogy of Seth. Why? Because God is trying to show you, where did the seed go? The seed has now moved from Adam to Seth. It's not Cain, it is Seth. You remember in one of the sessions I told you about the principle of the firstborn, and God skips the first and goes to the second one, because the first one always becomes a target of Satan's deception, and this is the case. Cain was not the heir to the seed, and yet Seth is. So we come all the way to verse 23 and 24. Right in the middle of this story, which is very important, that's why you shouldn't be skipping genealogies, because sometimes right in the middle of the genealogy you see a little verse. How many of you have read the prayer of Jabez or Jabez? That's right in the middle of a genealogy of Judah, talking about this man in, I think, 1 Chronicles. So it's talking about a person that we like to hear about him. But if you skip the genealogy, you're not going to read about him. And here's the same thing. The seventh person from Adam is Enoch. Enoch is the seventh from Adam. So you count down, and the seventh one is Enoch. And so Enoch lived 365 years. All the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was no more, for God took him. Well, there's a lot of interesting points about this man. Who was this Enoch? We don't have a lot of information about him, but I can say this, that he walked with God. And what does walking with God mean? We hear this all the time. He's walking with God, or this great character of the Bible walk with God. Well, you can simplify walking with God is full understanding of what God wanted and what God would do to obtain it. If you want to walk with God, you have to know what He wants. How could you walk with someone if you have no idea what He's after? And agreement with God. In other words, you have to agree. There's a verse in Amos chapter 3, verse 3 says, do two walk together unless they have agreed to do so? Walking requires agreement. And agreement requires understanding. So if you want to walk with God, ladies and gentlemen, is not what you think, that from now on I got to quit my job and get 24 hours on my knees and get all the goosebumps, and that means I'm walking with God. That's not walking with God. To walk with God means to know Him, to understand what He's after, and to agree with Him. Say, Lord, I agree with that. If you say, I agree with you, you're walking with Him. You don't need to have these special sensation of you think you're walking with Him. You know you're walking with Him if you're in agreement with Him because you understand His plan and purpose, because you know Him. And that is really walking that Enoch was doing. He was walking because he knew what God wanted to do, and he said, I agree with that. When you give God consent and agreement, you're walking with Him. He says, come along. And there are so many examples like that. That agreement means consent to understand and agree with what He's after. So, it was also these men that Enoch, I'm reading now from the book of Jude. Where is the book of Jude? At the very end of the Bible, just before the book of Revelation. That's one reference in the New Testament to Enoch, at least, that we have. And we see in book of Jude book of Jude, there's only one chapter, verse 14 and 15. It says, it was also about these men that Enoch in the seventh generation from Adam prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord came with many thousands of His holy ones to execute judgment upon all and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds, which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against Him. Did you count how many times He says ungodly? Enoch could see around him what was going on, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. You remember by chapter 4, it says, by chapter 6, when we get there in a few slides, you're going to see the entire world is already completely under the power and dominion of Satan. So Enoch was observing this, and he knew where things were going. The church needs to know where things are going today. We cannot close our eyes and pretend everything is going well. It is moving in a direction that Enoch had already seen at that time, just before the flood. And we need to be just as awake and just as aware and just as sensitive as Enoch was, that he could see what was coming. I think Enoch could smell the waters in the clouds, that they were just piling up. And today the church needs to know that we're not getting any better. The world is getting worse by the day, and it's eventually going to result, as Peter says in the 2 Peter chapter 3, not by waters being judged this time, but by fire will be judged this time. And that is not going to be a very pleasant idea. And that's why we need to be very vigilant and active in helping people to get out before it is too late. So here is Enoch, seventh from Adam. Well, I guess you know now, some numbers have meanings in the Bible. The seventh means there was a perfect cycle of observation, and humans had gone through 7 generations of seeing what disaster they have created over time. And Enoch was the 7th, and he saw, and it says, he was no more. He walked 365 years, he was no more. Meaning that God took him off this earth. In a miraculous rapture, Enoch was taken out. Why? Because the flood is about to come. So here we see that Enoch is a type of the victorious and outstanding rapture of those who walk with God are taken before the flood of God's judgment. There is going to be a select, outstanding rapture for the victorious, overcoming believers. God has promised the overcomers who are paying a price here and now and suffer for the sake of righteousness and Christ will be given the honor of being taken out first. That is what the Word of God says. And I can show you from the book of Revelation that there are very distinct raptures, and this particular one I would call the Enoch rapture. It is reserved for those who walk with God. Now, do we want to walk with God, or do we just want to take our sweet time and just wait and see? And then all of a sudden, Jesus said to his disciples, remember in the days of Noah. We're going to get there in a minute. Enoch saw the coming kingdom of the Son and warned all of its consequences. So, the end of chapter 5 is the introduction of Noah. Noah is the 10th generation from the first one, which is Adam. And his name means he that will bring rest. Noah will bring rest, or what happens in his time will bring about rest to this turbulent world that has to be destroyed by the flood. So now we go to Genesis chapter 6, verse 1. This is one of those very mysterious and controversial chapters in the book of Genesis. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, first of the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves whenever they chose. Very mysterious and controversial verse here. Many commentators have given many opinions, and some could be correct and some very weird. But the two predominantly popular interpretations of these two verses, of these set of verses, is as follows. Sons of God. The controversy is, who are the sons of God? So some Bible scholars would say the sons of God are the sons of Seth, and the daughters of men are the daughters of the tribe of Cain. In other words, there are two tribes. They want to intermarry. So they take the boys from Seth, which are good tribe, give it to the girls from Cain tribe, which are the bad tribe. And they're going to marry each other. Well, they're all humans. They're cousins. They can marry each other. But some scholars would say Satan wanted this thing to happen so that the purity of Seth's family would be destroyed, because the seed is in the Seth family. So by bringing in corruption of these daughters from Cain's side that are not so very good, is going to pollute, is going to make the whole thing go bad. So that could be correct, but the one that we hold that to be the more correct interpretation is the sons of God are actually angels. Not the good ones, the bad ones. The fallen angels who have, by a very mysterious process, one time in history, have transgressed their boundaries, have come into an area where God had not permitted them, and have taken humans as captive. Why do I say that? Because when you go back to the verse, there's something interesting about the verse here. And the verse says, they took wives for themselves whenever they chose. In other words, these girls, these humans, had no choice. They were taken by force. They had no free will. It says, whenever they chose. Who chose? The sons of God. The sons of God would just go around and see who they wanted to take, and they would take them. Now, the question is, can angels actually reproduce? Well, the Bible shows us that angels don't marry and they don't reproduce. So how did they do it? I don't know. All I know is it's possible that they actually took human form, a male form, and then they took these innocent girls and they started to marry by force, a mass raping of the human race, so that every child that would be born out of the relationship of these angels who had now taken human form, perhaps, with these girls would result in abnormally weird and strange creatures. That could be another interpretation, which is more correct. It's the weirder, the more correct probably it is, because the Bible is not very logical. The Bible is usually very mystical in some of these areas. Well, I will show you why I think these were angels. We'll take a look at a few references. Sons of God. Is there any other precedence in the scriptures that the angels are known as sons of God? Here are two examples. In Job chapter 1, verse 6 to 12, if you read, it says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." So who were these sons of God? It definitely has a reference, because if Satan was there, he is an angel, and the sons of God must have been also angels. It's a general term defining angels. And why does the Bible use the word sons of God? Because the word son in the biblical definition is when any creation or any creature serves the interests of his master, he is in a relationship of a father and a son. When a person does the will of his master, that relationship is known as a relationship like a father and a son. Son is a servant. So there are two descriptions of sons of God. There is the general description, which could include angels, and then we have the Son of God, which is the exclusive, unique identification of Jesus Christ. Okay? So in Job chapter 2, verse 1, again, it says again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. So here's two references to the sons of God. Is there any more reference? Perhaps. Here's another one. In Job chapter 38, verse 7. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. There's no other explanation as to what the sons of God should be referring to. And then, of course, in Jude chapter 6, Jude verse 6, Jude tells us something happened which has a direct reference to Noah. It says here, "And the angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode," in other words, their boundaries, he has kept in the eternal bonds under the darkness for the judgment of the great day. What happened to these angels that they did not keep their domain and they transgressed? Who is he referring to? Well, he is referring to that day in Genesis chapter 6, when a group of fallen angels left their boundaries. God had placed a boundary and said, angels cannot enter earth. Angels cannot enter earth and have direct contact with humans, particularly Satan and his fallen angels. And yet a group of them disobeyed, even though they're rebels, but they still have to maintain certain protocol. They transgressed, they entered, and the result was that some abnormal human beings were born that were totally evil, complete evil. And when you read that, it says that what happened? Some of the fallen angels descended on earth without God's permission. Satan's scope of authority, ladies and gentlemen, Satan has been given a certain boundaries to operate. Did you know that? Did you know that Satan is not completely loose and Satan is not completely free to do whatever he wants to do? The things that Satan does today, it is within a defined boundaries that God has told him. You cannot go beyond those boundaries. But in that boundary, you can do whatever you want. How do we know that? When he had a conversation with God in the book of Job, God specifically put the boundary on Job, said, you can do whatever you want, but you cannot take his life. So there are places where God says, cannot cross that line. Even Satan cannot cross that line. Mass assault on humans, possession of all human bodies, and reproducing giants and abnormal humans. The Bible calls them Nephilims. Nephilims, these were giant humans. These were humans that we have not seen the likes of them. Extremely evil, complete evil, no sense of humanity in them, no ability to act like a human, but like a beast. They were human beasts. We have not seen these creatures, but the power behind these humans were the result of the fall that happened. As I said, you can choose which of these two theories you want to accept. Are they the sons of Seth with the daughters of Cain, or are they fallen angels? It seems to me, and most commentators would agree, that the weight is more on the side of these angels having crossed a certain line and done some very, very evil things. And I can justify that by saying, what was the primary purpose of Satan in trying to do that? Why would Satan go through this, or at least a group of his angels would do that? To destroy the human race. So the seed would be destroyed right there. No more seed. And of course, is God going to be caught off guard? He already had a family that he had kept apart, and they were not contaminated with the same problems that the rest of the people were. So God is never going to lose. God will always have his elect that will stand for him. And that also goes back to the principle of the remnant. Because in the midst of all the family of Seth, which were more godly people, all of them eventually were surrendered into this problem except one family, and that was Noah and his children. So that the Lord said, Genesis chapter 6, verse 3 and 4, my spirit shall not strive with man forever. In other words, what it means here is that my spirit is not going to keep guiding man from this point. Because up to that point, even though they were out of the Garden of Eden, God would still speak to them, would guide them. You remember he spoke to Cain. So he would be communicating, trying to help them. But it says no more. Because this particular kind of human race is beyond hope, beyond redemption. They're just not going to do anything to change. It is beyond any hope. It says, because he is also flesh, nevertheless his days shall be 120 years. God limited at that point, decided that man would not live more than 120 years. Because if the evil that man is now capable of committing is given 900 years or 1,000 years, guess how much more evil will be done under this sun? We already live 120, and we do pretty much a lot of evil in our lives. And guess you live 5 times more, 6 times more than that, how much more evil you can commit. So God limited the scope of evil that would be able to be committed by humans, 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. mysterious. What were these children that the Bible says they were mighty men who were of old, men of renown? Again, there are many different theories as to who these children were, but you know what? Some people have speculated, and some of these parts I'm just telling you as a story. There's a theology in it, but I'm telling you for you to know there's a lot of things that we don't know, but God has given us clues here and there. The entire human race, with the exception of Noah's family, was possessed by these angels and enslaved. The matter of the seed was at stake. Satan wanted the human race destroyed so that the seed would not come. A gross, unlawful violation of the divine will had happened in this particular juncture in history. God wanted to maintain the seed, and Satan wanted to completely obliterate the seed from the face of the earth. One quick thing also, because you need to know, in the Bible we have 3 heavens. We have the first, second, and third heaven. We've talked about this before. The third heaven is where God's presence is. That's where Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 that I was raptured to the third heaven. The second heaven is where angels are. And Paul calls it the heavenly places, where our battle is not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers and hosts of darkness in the heavenly places. He's referring to that second heaven, which is beyond our vision. We don't see it, but it is there. And of course, the first heaven is where we see this atmosphere and the space around us, and that would be man's presence. God's presence, angels' presence, and man's presence. So what does Satan want to do? Not only take possession of second heaven, but also have full control of first heaven. Where was he before? When he started his career, he was in the third heaven. When he rebelled, he fell into the second heaven. And when the tribulation comes in the last days, when Christ descends from the third heaven to take over the second heaven with the church, Satan is going to be pushed down into the first heaven, which is on earth, in the person of Antichrist. You're going to see Satan personified. Satan take flesh, and so on. Why did I say that? Because the angels, from where they were supposed to be, transgressed and came into where man's presence was supposed to be. So the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he said, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things, and to birds of the sky. Notice the fish was not mentioned here, because the fish don't get destroyed in the water. They love the water. They swim in the water. For I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 to 8. And we're coming almost to the end. The wickedness of man. Did you notice what God said about man in Genesis chapter 6? I highlighted some of those. Man's wickedness had reached its ultimate point. Ladies and gentlemen, man's wickedness is about to reach its ultimate point very shortly. The world of that time reached it once. This world will reach it again. If not one time, maybe a few times. But this one that is ahead of us, it is the ultimate depravity, corruption, and deviation of man from God's original plan and purpose. It is just ahead of us. You know, when you're driving on a highway and all of a sudden you see a bend in the road and they give you a sign that this is going to have a sharp turn, we're about to take that sharp turn. I think the events in the last 18 years, counting from year 2000, and the rapid changes and the type of things that have happened, is very quickly telling us that very sharp bend is just around the corner. And man is going to come very close to destroying himself unless the Lord intervenes and stops this madness. The direct presence of satanic powers magnified this. In other words, God already knew that man is corrupt Cain is already moving further and further away. And Satan was actually helping this by making it even more a matter of a complete deviation and separation from God. And notice what the verse says. Every intent of the thoughts of his heart. We have to be very careful not to think that man has something that is still good in him. Every intent. It doesn't say God said was some of the intent of his heart. He said every intent. You know why? Because God can actually see like an X-ray inside your thoughts. Actually, the moment your cells in your brain want to create the thought, he's already seeing what's going to be put together, which words, which pictures are going to come in your mind, and you're going to create a thought. He's already seen that. And that's a horrible thing and frightening thing, to know that God can even know, and he knows your thoughts even before you have had the chance to think it. He knows it. Every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. I mean, how many ways God can emphasize what he sees? He sees something that it's absolutely non-negotiable. He's not saying, well, some of the intents are sometimes, not all the time, once in a while. Every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, non-stop. So even the good thoughts that you think you're thinking, God goes right behind it, underneath it, and looks at the intents. Why did you even have a good thought? Why did you even think the good thought? Is it because you're such a good person and you want to tell everyone you're good? But you even thought that good thought because deep underneath you said, I'm going to have something good because I want to show that I'm good. Every intent of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. Jesus warned a day is coming when we have to remember this story. So here we go in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24. That's the chapter of his second coming. It says, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also be the day coming of the Son of Man. Before, as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. Sounds very normal things, you know. You eat, you drink, you have parties. But you know what? It tells us that they were completely unaware. When it says they were eating and drinking and giving marriage, means they were unaware. They didn't even want to think about it. They didn't even want to consider the fact that there will be such a thing coming. And you know what? They had no excuse, because Enoch had warned them. You know, the father of Enoch is Lamech. Not the bad one, the good one. There's a good one in chapter 5 of Genesis. The bad one is in chapter 4. Lamech is like Joe. It's a common name at that time. Lamech, the good guy, was alive just before the flood. And he was the 6th generation. So they used to live a long time, and they would remember these stories. Enoch had prophesied that, watch out, the kingdom is coming, God is coming to set the record straight. The people at the time of Noah had no excuse, because they had heard about Enoch, and more so, Noah preached 120 years that the judgment is coming. And I think the church sometimes forgets to preach the judgment is coming. If we talk about sin, we need to talk about the judgment also. You cannot talk about sin unless you talk about the judgment. And the judgment that the church preaches is first the judgment on the cross. That God judged sin on the cross. When Jesus died, that was the wrath of God that poured out on his own Son, so that he may not pour out that wrath on you and me. But that judgment is still reserved for those who are not willing to take the grace of God and to be rescued. until the day that Noah entered into the ark and knew not, until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Brothers and sisters, there are two events ahead of us. Enoch needs to be taken. And after Enoch, there will be the preparation for the flood. And Noah needs to be prepared. There are many interpretations as to what Noah represents. I'm not going to get into all the interpretations, but here's Noah. Noah found favor, or the word is grace, in the eyes of the Lord. Noah is a type of the redeemed man that will escape the flood of judgment and stands for the believers who will go through the flood, though protected from harm and yet deprived of the blessing of that liberating rapture of Enoch. So you have the Enoch raptured, and then you have the Noah raptured. Noah also escaped, but he had to go through that disaster. And that's why we've been saying that it is possible. And I'm not saying definitively, I'm not saying this with 100% certainty, but I'm telling you it is possible that the Lord will take the overcomers first. And some Christians need to experience the flood without being destroyed in the flood through a vessel of escape, but they will deprive themselves of that blessing. They will be in a situation of containment and very, very sad situation. It's possible. I'm not dogmatic about it. So Enoch versus Noah. Enoch is a type of the overcoming remnant that are removed from and before the flood. Noah is a type of God's gracious removal of the redeemed through the flood. So which one do we want to be? Do we want to be a Noah type believer, or do we want to be an Enoch type of believer? Now, whether this is absolutely correct theologically, it's irrelevant. Because you know what? Even if all believers are raptured at the same time, I still want to be identified with Enoch. I still want to be identified with Enoch because I know for sure he didn't see the flood. That I know for sure. I'm not going to gamble and say, well, you know what, let's see what happens. Maybe all of them are going to go together. Yeah, maybe all of them will go. But I can put my bets on the fact that Enoch went before the flood, so I want to be part of that kind of a believer. And this church wants you and I to be that kind of a believer. So let's hold fast to the confession of our faith, know that there is a judgment coming, and we need to be prepared spiritually to walk with God, in agreement with God, so God can remove us before the disaster hits. Amen? God bless you.